Welcome to a new episode of Policy Implications podcast, where policy meets research. I'm your host, Olga Zadorozhna from Kozminski University, where I teach and do research in empirical economics. My guest today is Fanny Landaud, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Norwegian School of Economics. Fanny's main area of expertise is education and labor economics. And today we'll be discussing her recent paper called Getting Lucky, the long-term consequences of exam luck, co-authored with Eric Moran, Barton Village, and Alexander Villain. This paper studies the impact of exam luck on educational and economic success, and I predict this episode will be of special interest to our students. So welcome, Fanny. I'm very happy to have you on the podcast and be discussing this research with you. But before we start our discussion of the paper, please tell us more about your research and how did you become interested in this topic?
So thanks a lot for inviting me. So in general, I do research in applied economics, and I'm especially interested in questions related to education. And so indeed, in the recent paper that you mentioned, which is co-authored with Eric, Barton, and Alexander, we studied the long-term consequences of luck at high-stake exams. So the idea is very simply that in most settings, taking an exam is like taking a lottery, in the sense that two individuals, two students who have a similar ability may end up with very different results just because one was lucky and got questions on the favorite topics while the other didn't. And so in this paper, what we do is that we try to understand whether this form of luck in exam content only has a very short-term effect on the grades, or whether it also impacts students' outcome on the longer run, whether it impacts their education, whether it impacts their wages. And I guess that one of the reasons why I got interested in this type of topic is because, as many of us, I took many exams throughout school. And in my case, I was especially bad in history. So I always wondered what would have happened if I could have avoided getting exams in history, or if at the very least within history, I could have had questions on the few topics I was not so bad in. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess everyone is wondering the same thing as you are, so I can totally relate to that. And so in your paper, you examine the effect of exam luck on the future success of a person using the Norwegian data. Please tell us more about the Norwegian educational system that allows you to measure the effect of luck.
So in Norway, there is in fact two quite interesting educational features that we use. The first thing that we use is the fact that in Norway, at the end of high school, students take external exams, but they do not take exams in all the courses. Instead, they take exams in a subset of the courses, and this subset is randomly chosen. So this enables us to measure exam luck, because for each student, we know all the courses that they take, and we know the teacher grade in all the courses. So we know basically if the topics in which they are assigned for examination is a good draw for them or if it's not. And also then we can rely on this random assignment of exam topic to really try and identify causal effects, because the exam topics are randomly chosen.
Right. Oh my goodness. I don't know if it's good for the students or not. I'm not decided, because I haven't had this type of an exam in my life that someone would randomly decide whether I take, for example, history versus literature versus mathematics, and I'm a bit wow.
Yeah. So the only thing I can say on that is that I think every year, like you see newspapers in Norwegian, like articles in Norwegian newspaper describing that some students are not very happy about the draw of exam that they got, and typically because they feel that it may be a bit unfair to them to being drawn into the topic that they don't know very well, while the classmates got a much better draw of exam. So I also went through a different schooling system, because I went through the French schooling system, which also basically has examined all the topics. But I can imagine that, well, I would have been happy not to get an exam in history, but if I had only gotten an exam in history, then maybe I would have not have been so happy.
Of course.
So to come back to the other features of the Norwegian setting that we're using is also the fact that the students in Norway, whether they get the diploma and the high school average, the GPA, are determined by two different criteria. And this is an interesting feature because it enables us to study the mechanisms, the channels through which exam luck matters. Because here the idea, very simply, is that at the end of high school, the results of students to the exam are important for mainly two reasons. So first, because they will determine whether students get their diploma and can pursue in higher education. And second, because they will determine the high school grade average, the GPA, which is what students use to apply to universities. So to try and understand about the mechanism, it is interesting to try and understand whether exam luck matters through its effect on the diploma and access to higher education, or through its effect on the GPA and the type of higher education that students can get. And because in Norway, whether students get the diploma and the GPA is determined by two different criteria, we can actually construct two measures of exam luck. So the two measures, they rely on this random draw of examinations, but one is going to affect the probability that students get the diploma, and the other one is going to affect the GPA.
Okay, so and before we discuss the details on your measures, I wanted to also ask about the literature and what did we know about luck and the effect it has on people's labor market and financial success before your paper.
So regarding the literature on luck, I think so one first literature that I know of and that's very interesting, that there is a few papers which have highlighted the fact that the conditions in which the students take exams are quite important as well for their results. So for example, if they take an exam when there's a heat wave or pollution spike, then they tend to perform less well and they have worse outcome on the longer run. But here, so in our setting, what we do is that we study a kind of different form of exam luck, which is luck in exam content. And regarding maybe a bit more generally the role of luck for individuals' economic success, there's also a very large and interesting literature on the role of the birth lottery. So here, basically what these papers usually emphasize is that children that are born into different families tend to have very different trajectories in education and on the labor market.
Right, and so back to the measures of luck. So how exactly do you construct them and what data do you use to do so?
So in terms of the data, so basically we use the administrative data from Norway. So we have information on all the students, on 7 cohorts of students who enrolled in the last year of high school in the academic track. And so for all the students, we have detailed information. We know all the courses that they take during the last year of high school. And for each of the courses, we know the teacher grade that they get. And we also know among all of these courses in which topics they were drawn for examinations at the end of high school. So this is basically the information that we use to construct our two different measures of exam luck. So one is basically going to be measuring to what extent the draw of exam is higher, like gives a higher GPA than what they could have had on average for all the counterfactual draws of examinations. And the other measure is going to basically measure the likelihood that the students will get a grade of 1, because if the students get a grade of 1 in any of their courses, then they fail the course, and they don't get the diploma. And so we're going to basically construct a measure that's going to be indicative of whether the draw of exam that the students get gives them a higher or lower probability of having a grade of 1 among the courses compared to what they could have had on average for all the counterfactual draws of examinations. And then the other type of data that we use, so it's still the administrative data from Norway. We basically have very detailed data that enables us to follow the students into the higher education system and on the labor market to measure for each of the students the universities in which they enroll after high school, the field of study in which they enroll after high school, and also we have tax record information so that for each of the students, we know their gross labor income in each of the year. And so that's the data that we're using to both measure exam luck and to assess its consequences on students' future education and on the labor market outcomes.
And so what are the main results of your study? Are there differences when it comes to your diploma luck versus GPA luck measures and their long-term effects on people's lives?
So yes, there are differences in terms of the effect of diploma luck and GPA luck. So the first thing that we show is that in fact, diploma luck does not really have long-term consequences. And this result seems to be mostly driven by the fact that the students who fail to get the diploma due to a bad draw of exam at the end of high school end up just returning to school, they take additional courses, and they graduate at a later point in time. And by contrast, we find that the GPA luck does create a persistent effect on students' education and on the labor market outcomes. So in terms of higher education, we find that GPA luck does not really change the quantity of higher education that the students get, but it enables them to enroll in preferred and most selective universities and fields of study. And then in terms of the labor market outcomes, we find that GPA luck generates higher wages 9 years later. And in terms of the magnitude of the effect, what we find is that actually the effect of GPA luck is quite similar to the effect of being born in a family where the father or the mother has about 2 additional years of education. So put it differently, our results imply that exam luck, when it happens at key stages of students' education career, can actually have an effect which is not that different from the birth lottery.
Okay, that's very interesting, actually. And do you think the similar effects may be observed in other countries, not necessarily in Norway, or they're just Norway-specific results?
So this is always a little bit of a tricky question. So I think that the general concept of exam luck is not specific to Norway. In many, many contexts, when you have an exam, it's never going to be exhaustive. So you're always going to have some students who are going to get lucky in terms of exam content and are going to get questions on a topic that they know better than another topic. The only thing is that, so here in Norway, what we use is variation across topics, while in many settings, what you would have is variation within topics. And then the question is whether this type of exam luck, whether it is across topic or within topics, will it have a similar effect on students' academic and economic success on the longer run in other countries than Norway? And for that, I think that to answer this question, 2 important points are whether the exams in questions happen at key stages of students' education career, and also in terms of institutional feature, how do universities select the students? So for example, if we think about another country such as the US, here I would expect, for example, that similar students could get very different results to the SATs, depending on whether one student is strong in geometry, the other student is strong in algebra, and the year when they take the SATs, whether it's more on algebra, whether on geometry. And then because in the US, the university also rely a lot on the SATs to select the students, then these 2 students with different exam luck to the SATs could also have very different trajectories.
Right. Okay. And so what are the main policy implications of your study? How can we make sure that educational system is more reflective of students' abilities and less dependent on pure luck?
So in terms of policy implication, I guess that the first thing that our study shows is that when we rely heavily on a few key exams to select and screen applicants, then we run the risk of having important mismatches and unfair allocations of students to universities enough young workers to jobs and occupation. And then in terms of designing an exam system that minimizes the role of luck, one first idea could be to try and have more exams at more regular points in time. But however, we also have to acknowledge that exams are usually costly to organize. So there is a need for a fine trade-off between the additional costs of having more exams and the desire for having a finer measure of a student's ability, which is something that's very interesting, but is a bit beyond the scope of our current study. But it would be very interesting to study this question.
Sure, and I hope actually universities and different countries across the world will find these balance to balance between the exam time and efficiency and the time of the professors, and also the system that is more reflective of students' abilities. So thank you, Fanny. I think this paper is very interesting, and it will be, as I said before, mostly interested for our students. And I do hope we all can learn something from this research and implement a more evenly distributed educational system towards the abilities, not necessarily luck. So thank you very much, Fanny. I enjoyed our conversation.
Well, thanks a lot for your time, for the invitation, and for your interest in this research.
Sure.